Introduction to server controls. It's important to understand how server controls operate and how they are completely different from the way you define controls in other languages like classic ASP or PHP, another popular programming language creating dynamic websites. The text in a text box in these languages, you would use plain HTML and mix it with server-side code. As you can see, this code contains plain HTML mixed with the server-side block delimited by open tag percentage and percentage close tag that outputs the current time using the equals symbol. This type of coding has a major disadvantage. The HTML in the server-side code is mixed, making it difficult to write and manage your pages. Although this is a trivial example in which it's still easy to understand the code, this type of programming can quickly result in very messy and complex pages. Server controls work differently. In ASP.NET, the controls live on the server inside an ASPX page. When the page is requested in the browser, the server-side controls are processed by the ASP.NET runtime, the engine that is responsible for receiving and processing requests for ASPX pages. The controls then emit client-side HTML code that is appended to the final page output. It's this HTML code that eventually ends up in the browser, where it's used to build up the page. Instead of defining HTML controls in your pages directly, you define an ASP.NET server control with the following syntax, where the italicized parts differ for each control. The ID attribute is used to uniquely identify a control on the page, so you can program against it. It's important that each control on the page has a unique ID. Otherwise, the ASP.NET runtime won't understand what control you're referring to. If you accidentally type a duplicate control ID, VWD will signal the problem in the error list. The mandatory run_at attribute is used to indicate that this is a control that lives on the server. Without this attribute, the controls won't be processed and will end up directly in the HTML source. If you ever feel you are missing a control in the final output in the HTML of the browser, ensure that the control has this required attribute. Note that for non-server elements like plain HTML elements, the run_at attribute is optional. With this attribute on non-server controls, they can be reached via programming code. Note that the control has two attributes, ID and run_at. You can easily add the run_at attribute to an existing element by typing run_at and pressing the tab key. For the controls that ship with ASP.NET 4, you always use the ASP prefix followed by the name of the control, for example, to create a text box that can hold the same welcome message and current time. The preceding example of the text box is using a self-closing tag where the closing slash is embedded in the opening tag. VB.NET message.text equals hello world, the time is, and date time dot now dot time of day dot toString open close brackets. C# message.text equals hello world, time is plus date time dot now dot time of day dot toString open close brackets. This is quite common for controls that don't need to contain child content such as text or other controls. However, the long version using a separate closing tag is acceptable as well. You can control the default behavior of closing tags per tag using Tools, Options, Text, Editor, HTML, Formatting, Tag-specific options. You can program against this text box from code that is either placed in line with the page or in a separate code behind file. The definition of the control in the markup section of the page is now separated from the actual code that defines the text displayed in the text box, making it easier to define and program the text box, or any other control, because it enables you to focus on one task at a time, either declaring the control and its visual appearance in the markup section of the page, or programming its behavior from a code block. You add a text box, a label, and a button control to a page. When you request a page in the browser, these server controls are transformed into HTML, which is then sent to the client. By looking at the final HTML for the page in the browser, you will see how the HTML is completely different from the initial ASP.NET markup. In the Demos folder in the Solution Explorer, create a new web form called controls_demo.aspx. Choose your programming language and make sure the web form uses code behind. Switch to Design View From the toolbox, drag a text box, a button, and a label control onto the design surface within the dashed lines of the open tag div close tag that was added for you when you created the page. Type the text your name in front of the text box and add a line break between the button and the label by positioning your cursor between two controls in design view and then pressing enter. If you're having trouble positioning the cursor between the controls, place it after the label control and then press the left arrow key twice. The first time you press it, the label will be selected. The second time the cursor is placed between the two controls, enabling you to press enter. Right-click the button and choose Properties to open up the Properties grid for the control. Pressing F4 after selecting the button does the same thing. The window that appears enables you to change the properties of the control, which in turn influences the way the control behaves at runtime. Set the control's text property to Submit Information and set its ID to Submit Button. Change the ID of the text box to your name using the Properties grid. Clear the text property of the label using the Properties grid. You can right-click the Properties label in the grid and choose Reset, or you can manually remove the text. You can leave its ID set to Label 1. Still in Design View, double-click the button to have VWD add some code to the code behind the page that will be fired when the button is clicked in the browser. Add the bolded line of code to the code block that VWD inserted for you. Save the changes to the page and then open it in the browser by pressing Ctrl plus F5. When it appears in the browser, don't click the button yet, but open up the source of the page by right-clicking the page in the browser and choosing View Source or View Page Source. You should see the following HTML code. Switch back to your browser, fill in your name in the text box, and click the button. When the page is done reloading, open up the source for the page in the browser again, using the browser's right-click menu. When you click the button, the control causes a postback, which sends the information for the controls in the page to the server, where the page is loaded again. Additionally, the code that you wrote to handle the button's click event is executed. This code takes the name you entered in the text box and then assigns it to the label control. The label control contains the text you entered in the text box, so when it is asked for the HTML, it now returns this. Although you defined the label control with the open tag ASP : label close tag syntax, it ends up as a simple open tag span close tag element in the browser. Because the text property of the label control is empty, you don't see any text between the two open tag span close tag tags. The same applies to other controls. An open tag ASP : text box close tag ends up as open tag input type equals text close tag, whereas the open tag ASP : button close tag ends up as open tag input type equals submit close tag. Defining controls in your pages. Simply drag controls from the toolbox onto the design surface of the page. This makes it very easy to add a bunch of controls to a page to get you started. However, because of the way the design surface works, it's sometimes difficult to add them exactly where you want them. If you look at the properties grid for some of the controls on a page, you will notice that many of them have similar properties. Properties for all controls. Access key enables you to set a key with which a control can be accessed at the client by processing the associated letter. Back color for color enables you to change the color of the background, back color, and the text, fore color of the control. Border color, border style, border width changes the border of the control in the browser. The similarities with the CSS border properties you saw in the previous chapter are no coincidence. Each of these three ASP.NET properties maps directly to its CSS counterpart. CSS class lets you define the HTML class attribute for the control in the browser. This class name then points to a CSS class you defined on the page or an external CSS file. Enabled determines whether the user can interact with the control in the browser. For example, with a disabled text box, enabled equals false, you cannot change its text. Font enables you to define different font-related settings such as font size, font names, and font bold. Height width determines the height and width of the control in the browser. Tab index sets the client-side HTML tab index attribute that determines the order in which users can move through the controls on the page by pressing the tab key. Tooltip enables you to set a tooltip for the control in the browser. This tooltip, rendered as a title attribute in the HTML, is shown when the user hovers a mouse over the relevant HTML element. Visible determines whether or not the control is sent to the browser. You should really see this as a server-side visibility setting because an invisible control is never sent to the browser at all. This means it's quite different from the CSS display and visibility properties. Types of controls. ASP.NET comes with a large number of server controls, supporting most of your web development needs. To make it easy for you to find the right controls, they have been placed in separate control categories in the Visual Web Developer Toolbox. For example, a text box has a text property, among many others, and a list box has a selected item property. Some properties can only be set programmatically and not with the properties grid. Standard controls. The standard category contains many of the basic controls that almost any web page needs. You've already seen some of them, like text box, button, and label controls earlier in this chapter. Many of the controls probably speak for themselves, so instead of giving you a detailed description of them all, the following sections briefly highlight a few important ones. Simple controls. The toolbox contains a number of simple and straightforward controls, including text box, button, label, hyperlink, radio button, and checkbox. Their icons in the toolbox give you a good clue as to how they end up in the browser. List controls. The standard category also contains a number of controls that present themselves as lists in the browser. These controls include list box, drop-down list, checkbox list, radio button list, and bulleted list. To add items to the list, you define open tag ASP : list item close tag elements between the opening and closing tags of the control. The drop-down list enables a user to select only one item at a time. To see the currently active and selected item of a list control programmatically, you can look at its selected value, selected item, or selected index properties. Selected value returns a string that contains a value for the selected item, like C# or Visual Basic in the preceding example. Selected index returns the zero-based index of the item in the list. With the preceding example, if the user had chosen C#, selected index would be 0. Similarly, when the user has chosen CSS, the index would be 2, the third item in the list. The bulleted list control doesn't allow a user to make selections and as such doesn't support these properties. For controls that allow multiple selections, like checkbox list and list box, you can loop through the items collection and see what items are selected. In this case, selected item returns only the first selected item in the list, not all of them. Container controls. This grouping can be done by putting the controls in one of the container controls, like the panel, the placeholder, the multi-view, or the wizard. For example, you can use a placeholder or the pane control to hide or show a number of controls at once. Instead of hiding each control separately, you simply hide the entire container that contains all the individual controls and markup. Link button and image button. The link button and the image button controls operate similarly to an ordinary button control. Both of them cause a post back to the server when they are clicked. The link button presents itself as a simple open tag a close tag element, but posts back using JavaScript instead of requesting a new page. The image button does the same but displays an image that the user can click to trigger the post back. Image and Imagemap. These controls are pretty similar in that they display an image in the browser. The Imagemap enables you to define hotspots on the image that when clicked either cause a post back to the server or navigate to a different page. Calendar. The calendar control presents a rich interface that enables the user to select a date. File upload. The file upload control enables the user to upload files that can be stored on the server. Literal, localize, and substitute. The literal is that it renders no additional tag itself. It displays only what you assign to its text property and is thus very useful to display HTML or JavaScript that you build up in the code behind or that you retrieve from a database. The localize control is used in multilingual websites and is able to retrieve its contents from translated resource files. The substitute control is used in advanced caching scenarios and enables you to update only parts of a page that is otherwise cached completely. AD Rotator. The AD Rotator control enables you to display random advertisements on your website. The ads come from an XML file that you create on your server. Because it lacks advanced features like click tracking and logging that are required in most but the simplest scenarios, this control isn't used much in today's websites. Hidden field. The hidden field control enables you to store data in the page that is submitted with each request. This is useful if you want the page to remember specific data without the user seeing it on the page. XML. The XML control enables you to transform data from an XML format to another format, like XHTML, for display on a page. Table. The OpenTag ASP:table tag control is in many respects identical to its HTML OpenTag table tag counterpart. However, because the control lives at the server, you can program against it, dynamically creating new columns and rows and adding dynamic data to it. HTML controls. The HTML category of the toolbox contains a number of HTML controls that look similar to the ones found in the standard category. For example, you find the input button that looks like the OpenTag ASP:button tag. Similarly, there is a select control that has the OpenTag ASP.Dropdownlist tag and the OpenTag ASP:"listbox tag as its counterparts.